The chandeliers at Almack's burned with the particular mercilessness of rooms designed to expose rather than illuminate, and Eliza Hartwell stood at the edge of the floor in a gown the color of pewter, holding Mrs. Fenton's ivory fan, watching the season declare its verdicts one by one. She had been standing in that precise spot for 20 minutes. No one had spoken to her. No one had looked at her with any intention beyond the accidental flicker of eyes that did not find what they were searching for and moved on. She was used to it. A lady's companion at £38 per annum learned very early that invisibility was not an accident of circumstance, but a function of the machinery itself. And the machinery at Almack's was in excellent working order tonight. It was Mrs. Fenton who had said it first, in the carriage on the way, adjusting her lace at the small mirror and not bothering to lower her voice. "You are here to carry my shawl, Miss Hartwell, and to make up the number at supper if needed. No one will remember you came." She had not said it cruelly. That was the particular quality of Mrs. Fenton's small cruelties. They arrived as practical observations, accurate, and therefore unanswerable. Eliza had folded her hands in her lap and watched the lamplit streets pass. She had been in service for 3 years, since her father's death had left her with a small wardrobe, a good education, and no income. She was 24 years old. She spoke French adequately, read Italian tolerably, played the pianoforte with more feeling than technique, and had learned that none of these things protected a woman from the arithmetic of her situation. £38 a year was the arithmetic of her situation. She did not resent it. Resentment required the luxury of an alternative. The ballroom filled steadily around her. She catalogued the usual features of the season's opening night: the diamonds, the new gowns, the mothers arrayed along the walls with the quiet ferocity of generals before a campaign, the young women in white moving through the patterns of a dance with expressions calibrated to suggest both accessibility and reserve. Eliza watched them with something between sympathy and the wry acknowledgement that the season was a courtroom in which every glance was a verdict, and she had already been acquitted by being forgotten. It was in the middle of this accounting that she saw the young woman standing alone near the second pillar, her back pressed almost imperceptibly against the gilded plaster, her fan working too fast for the room's temperature. She was perhaps 17. Her gown was new, the pale green of spring water, and her expression was the particular one Eliza had learned to recognize. The face of someone who had been told all her life that this moment would be glorious, and had discovered upon arrival that it was merely terrifying. 3 young men had passed her without stopping. A 4th was approaching now. And from his angle of approach and the quality of his posture, he was not coming for her. He was coming for the empty space beside her, which offered the clearest path to the refreshment room. The girl did not yet know this. Her fan had slowed. Her chin had lifted with an effort Eliza recognized as courage, and it was going to be wasted on a man who would walk past her in 4 steps and leave her standing there with the evidence of her hope visible to every set of eyes in the room. Eliza moved without deciding to move. She crossed the floor in a direction that put her next to the girl before the young man reached them. She said, quietly and with perfect social composure, "Miss, I believe your mother is asking for you at the far end of the room. I can escort you if you wish." It was a fiction. She had no idea who the girl's mother was or where she stood. It was, however, a fiction with a clear social function, and the girl understood it immediately. Her fan closed. The small, grateful tension in her shoulders released. They walked together toward the far wall, and behind them the young man arrived at the empty space and found it occupied by nothing more than a pillar. What Eliza did not see, because she was occupied with navigating the edge of the floor, was the figure who had stood motionless at the far side of the room and watched the entire sequence from the moment she began to move. Edmund Vane, the Duke of Asheville, stood with his hands behind his back and his face arranged in the expression his mother had once described as his diplomatic face, and his secretary had once described, in a private letter that was never sent, as the face of a man holding very still so nothing can touch him. He was 34. He was a duke. He was the most avoided person in the room, not from dislike, but from the category of distance that extreme rank imposed, the way a fire in a large hearth heated the whole room, but could not be approached beyond a certain point without burning. He had been here because his mother had required it. He had been watching the season's opening with the patient detachment of a man who had already decided what the evening meant and was waiting for it to end. Then a woman in a pewter gown had crossed the floor and quietly arranged a small act of mercy for a stranger. And his eyes had stilled on her back, and he had stood there holding a thought he had not yet formed into words. He would not form it tonight. The evening ended without them exchanging a single word. Constance, Dowager Duchess of Asheville, found him at the carriage. She was a tall woman, fine-boned and precise, with white hair dressed in the manner of a previous generation, and the kind of social certainty that had never, in 62 years, found reason to doubt itself. She touched his arm. Princess Dorothea arrives in London a fortnight hence. The Austrian ambassador confirms the settlement at £20,000. I have accepted, on your behalf, an invitation to dine at Cavendish Square when she is established. You will attend. He said nothing. His silence was the kind his mother had learned to interpret as neither consent nor refusal, and she had learned also that it eventually resolved into compliance when she gave it enough time and enough structure. She settled into the carriage with the quiet confidence of a woman whose scripts had always worked, and she was correct that they had, everywhere, until now. The fortnight passed in the usual manner of spring fortnights in London. Morning calls, afternoon rides, evening assemblies at which Eliza occupied her customary position in the room's periphery, and Mrs. Fenton occupied the center of whatever conversation she could arrange. Eliza carried the shawl. She poured the tea when the maid was slow. She read aloud in the evenings from whatever circulating library novel Mrs. Fenton had most recently acquired and then abandoned halfway through. She had learned to read at a pace that sounded engaged without being so, because she had, on one occasion early in her employment, become genuinely absorbed in a passage and been reproved for it. It was on a Thursday evening, when Mrs. Fenton had retired early with a headache, and Eliza had found herself free for the first time in 2 weeks, that she went downstairs to the kitchen passage, where Nora, the housemaid, had been confined for 3 days, with a persistent cough that the physician had attended to briefly and dismissed as not serious, which was the physician's way of saying it was not serious to him. Nora was 17, thin-wristed, with the particular pale look of someone who had been working since she was 12 and had not yet decided whether that was simply the nature of things or not. She was awake when Eliza came in. There was a single candle on the small table. Eliza sat down on the chair beside the bed, opened the volume she had brought, and began to read. She read for an hour. She chose passages from an account of a voyage to the Mediterranean, because Nora had once said she thought the sea must look like the sky if the sky were lying down. And Eliza had thought about that observation for several days afterward. She read about the color of the water off the coast of Lisbon, and about the smell of the harbor at Genoa, and about a morning when the author had stood on the deck at sunrise, and the whole sea had been the color of copper. Nora listened with her eyes sometimes open and sometimes closed, and when the hour ended, she was asleep, breathing more easily than she had in the morning. Eliza closed the book quietly. She turned and found the doorway was not empty. The Duke of Ashvale stood in the kitchen passage in a coat that said he had arrived from somewhere formal within the last hour, and his expression was not the diplomatic face. It was something else. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and encountered another entirely, and had not yet determined what to do with the discrepancy. He had called on Mrs. Fenton on an estate matter, his secretary had confirmed the appointment for this evening, and the footman who admitted him had not known which room to offer. He had followed the candlelight without thinking. He had stood in the doorway for 4 minutes before Eliza finished reading. She rose. The candle made a warm movement and settled. They were standing 6 feet apart in a passage that smelled of soap and coal dust and the lavender water someone had put on Nora's pillow. He said after a moment, "Is she very ill?" "No," Eliza said. "Only tired and lonely, and a little frightened. Reading helps with 2 of those." He held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than was necessary. Then he said, "I will tell the footman I was mistaken about the appointment," and left. She stood in the kitchen passage for a long time after. The candle burned down 1/2 an inch. She was not certain what had happened, only that something had shifted in the quality of the evening, the way the light changes before a storm without the storm having arrived. The formal dinner at Ashvale House came 2 weeks later. Constance had arranged it with the precision she brought to all operations requiring social outcome. The guest list was curated, 12 people, each placed to produce a specific social impression. Princess Dorothea sat at Edmund's right hand. She was 22, fair-haired, composed, and possessed of the calm certainty of someone whose entire life had provided consistent evidence that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not unkind. She was also not interested in the question of what it might mean to be the wrong person in the wrong room, because the question had never been addressed to her. Eliza sat below the salt. This was Constance's arrangement, precise as everything she did, and Eliza had understood the message from the moment she saw the placement cards. She was there because Mrs. Fenton had been invited, and Mrs. Fenton had brought her, and Constance had placed her at the table's furthest reach as an act of social taxonomy. Here is the companion. Here is where companions belong. Let the table's architecture say what a direct statement would make too visible. It worked as architecture. The 3 footmen who served that end of the table did so with the particular efficiency of people who had been told the lower seats were also attended to. The conversation around Eliza was adequate. She ate the soup, which was a cream of asparagus and very good. She listened to the gentleman at her left discuss the drainage situation on an estate in Lincolnshire. She was invisible. Across the table and 8 seats away, the Duke was speaking to Princess Dorothea in the measured register he brought to all formal occasions. His mother watched them with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose script was running as written. Twice, without appearing to look at the lower end of the table, Constance addressed a remark to the woman beside her in a voice pitched to carry. One forgets sometimes how necessary companions are as a practical matter. Rather like a well-made piece of furniture, functional, unnoticed, and one prefers it that way. The woman beside her laughed delicately. Eliza heard it both times. She kept her posture straight and her expression composed, and ate the remainder of the asparagus soup. The 3rd time was not at the table. It came during the after-dinner gathering in the drawing room, when Eliza had moved to the window to be out of the traffic of conversation. Constance appeared at her side with the silent arrival of a woman who had spent 40 years learning how to approach people in rooms without being perceived as approaching. She looked out the window alongside Eliza for a moment, as if they were both simply admiring the street below. Then she said, with the pleasant tone of someone correcting a minor domestic error, "Miss Hartwell, I trust you understand that whatever courtesies my son has extended to Mrs. Fenton's household are precisely that, and nothing more." He is a man with considerable obligations. You are a woman with none. I do not say this without sympathy. One does what one must. Only I would be distressed to think any misunderstanding had taken root. Eliza turned to look at her directly. I misunderstand nothing, Your Grace. Constance held her gaze for a moment with something that was not hostility, but was very close to it, the way cold weather is not ice, but produces it. Then she inclined her head the precise quarter-inch of social acknowledgement and moved away. Eliza turned back to the window. Outside, a carriage was moving slowly down the street, its lanterns leaving small trails of orange light in the damp air. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth. She was a woman with 38 pounds per annum, and no misunderstandings. It was 3 days after the dinner that Edmund came to Mrs. Fenton's drawing room on a call that was formally addressed to Mrs. Fenton, and which she received with the particular flustered pleasure of a woman who had not expected to be noticed by a duke, and was not certain what to do with the fact that she now was. He sat for 25 minutes. He drank his tea. He answered Mrs. Fenton's conversation with the correct quantity of response. He asked Eliza twice about the book she was mending the spine of. She answered briefly. He listened with a quality of attention she could not account for, and chose not to account for, because accounting for it would require her to consider possibilities she had been reliably informed were not available to a woman in her position, and she had not survived 3 years in service by indulging unavailable possibilities. She told herself it was obligation. He was a man of rank calling on a household connected, however peripherally, to his own social obligations. She was present in the room. He was well-mannered. It meant nothing. 2 days later, he rode in the park at the hour Mrs. Fenton regularly walked, and when Eliza fell behind to adjust a loose ribbon on her employer's bonnet, he slowed his horse and waited until she had caught up. He did not speak. He simply matched his pace to hers for 40 yards until the path widened and Mrs. Fenton was again beside them, and then he touched the brim of his hat and rode ahead. She told herself that meant nothing also. Her wound was old and well-maintained, the wound of a woman who had been told plainly, in the language of market and machinery, that she was forgettable. Her wound had proven its accuracy 3 years running. She trusted it. The single moment it wavered was a week before the garden party, when she passed him in the corridor outside Mrs. Fenton's music room. And he stopped, as if something had occurred to him, and said, "You have not been sleeping well." She stared at him. It was not a question she had been prepared for, because it was not a question anyone ever asked her. "I sleep adequately," she said. "You have circles under your eyes," he said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting a weather condition that were not there at Almack's. She was silent for a moment. "Nora's cough has worsened," she said at last. "I have been sitting with her at night." He was quiet. Something moved in his face that had nothing to do with the diplomatic expression. A shadow crossing the stone, there and gone. "See that the physician is called again," he said. "Tell him I have an interest in the matter." She said she would. He walked on. She stood in the corridor and listened to his footsteps retreat across the parquet, and understood that the wound had let something through it for the first time in 3 years, and she did not know what to do with that either. If you have been following Eliza this far and feel her steadiness in your chest as something almost personal, stay with her. What is coming will ask more of that steadiness before it returns it. If this story is finding you at the right moment, leave a comment. We read everyone. What Eliza did not know, and what no one in that season's social machinery had been inclined to tell her, was that Edmund Vane had not been cold by nature. He had been cold by accretion, the way ice forms in layers, each one thin and transparent, and the next one covering it until the whole weight became something that could bear a person standing on it without cracking. His wife's name had been Caroline. She had been 20 years old when they married, 22 when their daughter was born without difficulty, and 23 when the second child came early, in the house in the country, while he was in London attending to estate business he had judged could not wait. The estate business had, in fact, waited. The letter from the country arrived on a Tuesday morning and found him in his solicitor's office reviewing a perfectly manageable drainage dispute that would have kept another month without consequence. She had died on a Monday. He had arrived home on Wednesday. His daughter had been 3 years old and had looked at him from the foot of the stairs with the steadiness of a child who had already done her crying and was now only watching. He had stood in the entrance hall of Asheville with the sound of the house rung around him, and understood, with the particular clarity of the irreversible, that he had been elsewhere when the only thing that mattered had needed him present. That was 7 years ago. He had put Caroline's portrait on the wall of the library because it seemed required. He had not been able to look at it since. He had become very good at estate business and very careful about being present and very fluent in the social languages that required nothing of him and gave nothing back. He had been told by 3 separate people in the intervening years that grief was not the same as guilt, and he had listened politely to all 3 of them and continued believing they were wrong. His daughter Margot was now 10. She was at Asheville with her governess. He thought about her every morning and wrote to her every Thursday, and had not yet learned how to be in the same room with her without feeling the distance between what he was and what he ought to have been. The portrait remained on the library wall, unlooked at, a closed door he carried around inside the house of himself. This was the man Constance was attempting to match with a princess at £20,000, and she was not wrong that the match was rational. She was only wrong about what he was capable of feeling because she had, in her quiet, efficient way, decided that grief had resolved itself into indifference, and indifference could be managed by good social architecture. She had not watched him stand at a kitchen passage doorway for 4 minutes, listening to a woman in a plain gown read about the color of the sea to a sick girl who would not have been read to otherwise. The garden party was at Lady Ashbridge's house in Kensington on a May afternoon that had started well and softened into an overcast warmth, the kind of weather that flattered pale complexions and made the garden look like something from a watercolor. There were 60 guests. The roses along the south wall were in early bloom. A string quartet played from beneath a white canopy at the garden's far end. Eliza was standing near the rose wall when she heard her name. Not her name precisely. The phrase was, "Mrs. Fenton's little Hartwell girl," spoken by a woman she recognized as Lady Bracewell, a friend of Constance's, in a tone that managed to make "little" and "girl" carry a combined weight of social diminishment that neither word alone could have achieved. Eliza did not turn. She had heard it before. It was the 3rd time, and she knew the words the way you know weather. Not surprised by the rain, only by the particular angle it arrives from. The voice that followed was Constance's, level and precise. The matter is concluded, in any case. Mrs. Fenton has had occasion to reflect on the propriety of keeping Miss Hartwell in her household. One heard a report. A servant's testimony is generally reliable in these matters, I find. Eliza turned. Constance stood 6 feet away, facing Lady Bracewell, holding her fan at the measured height that meant the performance had been composed in advance. Nora stood 3 feet behind them, very still, in her household dress, her face the color of someone who had been brought somewhere and told something she did not yet fully understand. Mrs. Fenton was 10 yards distant, speaking to a woman near the fountain. She did not look at Eliza. She had not looked at Eliza since they arrived. Eliza understood this with a cold, clear apprehension. The way you understand a door is locked from the feel of the handle before you have turned it. The fabricated impropriety, as Constance had constructed it, was this. Eliza had been seen, by a reliable party, removing a volume from Mrs. Fenton's private library without permission, and reading it to a servant in circumstances suggesting a presumption of equality inconsistent with her position. The charge was delivered in Constance's polished vocabulary, which was to say it was delivered in language that could not be directly challenged without appearing to confirm the offense. An impropriety, once named by a dowager duchess to her circle, acquired the texture of established fact. Eliza stood for 3 seconds at the rose wall. She was aware of several things at once. The smell of the roses, which was specific and real and entirely indifferent to the conversation happening 6 feet away. The sound of the string quartet at the garden's far end, playing something in a minor key. The fact that Nora was standing behind the 2 women with the look of someone who had been brought to corroborate a version of events she had not agreed to corroborate. She crossed the 6 feet. "Your Grace," she said, with the tone she used when accuracy was required and courtesy had run out. "I took the volume with Mrs. Fenton's knowledge. Nora will confirm it if she is asked honestly and without her employer's proximity affecting her answer." Constance looked at her. For a single half-second, something behind her eyes recalculated, a slight recalibration of confidence, a flicker of something she would not have named as surprise because surprise required having been uncertain first. Then it closed. "Miss Hartwell," she said pleasantly. "Mrs. Fenton has already spoken with me. I think we need not continue this publicly." "I think," Eliza said, "that it was begun publicly." Lady Bracewell's fan stilled. 3 guests near the rose wall had stopped moving. The string quartet played on beneath the canopy. Constance said, with the finality of a woman closing a door, "You are dismissed from Mrs. Fenton's service. I believe she has indicated as much to you already this morning." She had not. She indicated it now, from 10 yards away, with a small apologetic movement of her shoulders that said she was sorry for the situation, in the general sense of preferring situations to resolve without discomfort. And not sorry in any sense that would cost her anything. Eliza walked out of the garden. She walked back to Mrs. Fenton's house, which she was still technically employed in until the end of the week, and she sat at the small writing table in her room and looked at the objects on it. A letter from her cousin in Bath, a small leather-bound volume of verse that had been her father's, a bottle of ink, a pen. She had £38 in the year, and no position, and no patron, and no plausible address in London beyond the end of the week. She was 24 years old, and the arithmetic of her situation had just changed its terms. She sat there for an hour and a half. She thought about the garden party and the rose wall, and Constance's fan held at its precise height. She thought about Nora's face, the look of a girl who had been brought to confirm a story and had instead confirmed something else entirely, to herself, if to no one else. She thought about the Duchess of Welford's evening reception, which was 2 days hence, which was the largest social event of the spring season outside Almack's itself, which was the single place in London where the maximum number of relevant witnesses would be gathered in one room. She thought about the cost. The cost was this: a dismissed companion appearing at a social event without employer or patron would be seen as a transgression. She would be noticed not as a companion, which is to say she would not be invisible, but as a woman who had done something improper and had then appeared in a room where propriety was enforced by the collective weight of 60 attentive people. It might not repair the situation. It would certainly not repair the situation quietly. She picked up the pen. She wrote a brief note to her cousin in Bath, explaining that her position had concluded and she would require a brief arrangement within the fortnight. She sealed it. She put it aside. Put it Then she opened her wardrobe and looked at the gray silk, which was the best thing she owned and which she had worn twice in 3 years, and she laid it across the bed. She was not going to the Duchess of Welford's reception to find a patron or to appeal to anyone's sympathy. She was going to say, in the only arena where it could be heard by the people who needed to hear it, that what had been said about her in Lady Ashbridge's garden was not accurate, and she was prepared to let the social consequences of saying so be whatever they were. She had no position to protect. That was, she realized with a cold clarity that felt almost like freedom, the only circumstance in which honesty was truly free. She dressed carefully. She went. The Duchess of Welford's reception occupied the first 3 floors of a house in Grosvenor Square that had been designed to accommodate exactly this kind of evening, every room opening into the next, so that the assembled guests could circulate at the pace of social necessity. Candles were in every fixture. The flowers were white. The music was elegant and undemanding in the way that music at important receptions always was, present enough to fill silence, quiet enough not to interfere with conversation. Eliza arrived without a card. She gave her name at the door with the precise composure of someone who had decided not to equivocate, and watched the footman's face process the situation and decide, after a moment's hesitation, to admit her. She thanked him. She went in. The room registered her, not loudly, not as a scene, but in the way that rooms register anomalies. A small shift of attention, a slight reorientation of conversational clusters near the entrance, a series of glances that lasted a half-second longer than social convention required before looking away. She had expected this. She walked forward. She had been in the room for perhaps 7 minutes, had reached the far end of the first salon, and was composing in her mind the sentence she intended to deliver to Lady Bracewell, who stood 20 feet ahead in conversation with 2 women she recognized from the garden party, when the room shifted again. It shifted the way rooms shift when someone of extreme social gravity begins to move through them, the small reorganization of space that crowds perform without deciding to, a widening of the path, a turning of faces. She did not need to look to know who it was. She had felt that quality of attention before in a kitchen passage, and in a corridor, and on a path in the park. And her body knew it the way the body knows a temperature change before the mind has named it. Edmund crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped in front of her. He was in evening dress. His face was the face she recognized, composed and still, but something in his eyes had the quality of a man who had made a decision some hours ago and was now simply executing it. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then he turned to face the room. The room was watching. The string quartet had reached the end of a phrase, and not yet begun the next. "Miss Eliza Hartwell," he said, in the carrying voice of a man who had no need to raise it, because the room had already quieted to hear him, "has been my guest in this city for the duration of this season, and will be until her circumstances are settled to her satisfaction. Any account to the contrary is mistaken." He paused. The pause was not long. It was exactly as long as the sentence needed to settle into the ears of 60 people who were not going to forget it. Then, in the same level tone, he continued, "I have spoken this morning with Lord Ashby. The matter of the cottage at Westerfield, which has sat in legal contingency since my father's death, has been resolved. The deed transfers to Miss Hartwell's use under a settlement confirmed this morning. She is not without a home, and she is not without a patron. She has, in fact, never been without either." The last sentence was the one that did the specific work Eliza heard it do. It said not that he was giving her something now, but that the dismissal, the charge, the fabricated impropriety, had been acts committed against a woman who was already under his protection, whether the hierarchy had known it or not. Princess Dorothea stood at the edge of the room near the fire. She had the expression of a woman who was composing her response with speed and precision, and who would, when she had composed it, walk away with more dignity than anyone else in the room. She did this. She inclined her head a measured quarter-inch toward Constance, and she walked toward the door with the carriage of someone who had lost nothing she had not already understood was not certain, which was perhaps the truest measure of her quality. And she departed. Constance stood very still. Her fan was at its usual height. Then it lowered, by a fraction, the first involuntary movement Eliza had ever seen the woman make. She was looking at her son with an expression that had given up the diplomatic surface, and was showing something older, and, if Eliza was reading it correctly, something that was not entirely without recognition. She was a woman whose script had always worked, meeting the one circumstance her script had not anticipated. A room full of witnesses, a son who had made his costly choice in public, and the discovery that the authority she had wielded with absolute confidence was social, not legal, and that it ended precisely where his began. Lord Ashby, who was a small, neat man who wore his legal precision like a well-made coat, confirmed, when 3 people within earshot asked variations of the same question, that the deed was executed and registered, that the property was unencumbered, and that the Duke's action was in every respect within his authority. He said it 3 times, with the mild patience of a man who considers repetition part of his function, and each time it settled another layer of certainty into the room. Nora appeared at the edge of the salon near the servants' entrance, her household dress replaced by a shawl she had borrowed from the kitchen maid, her face flushed from having walked faster than she should in her state of recovery. She had heard, from the footman who admitted Eliza, what had happened in the garden. She had walked 4 streets to be here. She stood in the doorway and looked at Eliza with the directness of a girl who had decided that the story being told about a woman who read to her by candlelight was not the story she was going to allow to go uncontested, and she had said as much to 2 women near the door who had asked her directly, with the simple accuracy of a witness who has nothing to protect and everything to confirm. Eliza saw her across the room. The thing that happened in Eliza's chest at the sight of Nora in the borrowed shawl was not a thing she had language for in the moment. It was the sensation of being seen, not as a social category, not as a companion or a problem to be managed or a piece of furniture that was functional and unnoticed, but as a person whose actual acts had been witnessed by someone who had the courage to say so. It was the oldest and most irreplaceable kind of being seen, and it came from a girl of 17 with a cough and a borrowed shawl, and it undid something in Eliza's chest that had been held for 3 years. She did not cry. She was standing in the middle of a reception room with 60 people watching her, and she was Eliza Hartwell, and she did not cry in public. She simply held Nora's gaze for 2 full seconds, and inclined her head once, with the warmth of a woman who had received something she had not known she was waiting for. Edmund appeared at her shoulder. He said quietly, so only she could hear it, "Come, Miss Hartwell. I think you have been here long enough for the evening's purpose." She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression that was not the diplomatic face, and not the shadow-crossing stone expression, and not anything she had catalogued before. It was the expression of a man who had stopped holding still. She said, "You will have managed to make the season considerably more interesting than it usually is." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that came before a smile in a man who had forgotten he was capable of them, and it lasted only a moment, but she saw it. She took his arm. They walked out together. The autumn came to Ashvale in the particular way of northern estates, without announcement, an overnight shift of light, the chestnuts along the drive turning in a single week from green to the dark copper that the gardener, a weathered man named Pitts, who had worked the estate for 30 years, described as the color the trees wore when they had decided to stop pretending it was still summer. Eliza stood at the window of the library on a Tuesday morning in October and watched the first snow. It was early snow, thin and hesitant, the kind that did not intend to stay, arriving as a preliminary observation rather than a commitment, laying itself over the copper leaves and the gray stones of the drive, and the shoulder of the hill beyond the garden wall in a white so pale it was nearly silver. She had been at Ashvale for 4 months. The cottage at Westerfield was hers by deed, plain and unambiguous, a solid stone building with 4 rooms and a kitchen garden and a view across the lower pasture that was, in the morning, the color of pewter shot through with gold. She was there very rarely. She was here, in the house, because she had been asked and because she had said yes, and because the answer to that question had, over 4 months, resolved itself from a practical arrangement into something she was only now allowing herself to name. Margot had accepted her with the calm directness of a child who had decided early that cautious assessment was more reliable than either suspicion or enthusiasm. She was 10 years old and precise, and had her father's quality of stillness in a room, but hers was the stillness of someone paying close attention rather than holding distance, and when she had decided, sometime in the 3rd week, that Eliza was reliable, she had indicated this by asking her to read the 2nd volume of A Natural History of Birds and not stopping her when she became absorbed in the passages about the winter migrations. Edmund had watched this from the doorway. He had not come in, but the following evening he had sat in the library while Eliza read and Margot listened, and the evening after that, and by the 4th week it had become the library's natural order, the fire in the hearth, the lamplight on the pages, the child asleep in the chair with her book tilted on her chest, and 2 adults in the quiet that does not require management. He had told her about Caroline on a September evening when the light was leaving the garden slowly, and Margot was with her governess. He had not told it as a confession. He had told it the way a man tells something he has carried alone for 7 years and has finally decided to set down somewhere it will be understood correctly. He told her about the drainage dispute that could have waited, about the letter arriving on a Tuesday, about the entrance hall and Margot at the foot of the stairs. He told her with his hands folded on the table and his voice level and uninflected in the way of a man who has gone over the facts enough times that the emotion lives underneath them rather than on the surface. She had listened. She had not said that grief was not guilt, because she understood that in this case, they were braided together and could not be separated by an outside party's observation. She had said, when he finished, that Margot looked at him the way children look at people they trust, and that it was worth knowing. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You see clearly." "I have had practice," she said. "It is the main advantage of invisibility. No one adjusts their expression for a person they are not looking at." He had looked at her then, directly, with the quality of a man who has understood something he ought to have understood earlier, and is not going to pretend he did not take too long. On the morning of the first snow, she heard him come into the library and stood at the window without turning. She heard the specific sound of him stopping in the middle of the room, and she heard the pause that followed, which was not the pause of a man with nothing to say, but the pause of a man choosing the order of his words. He said, "I have written to Ashby. The arrangements are as we discussed." She turned. He was standing in the middle of the library in his morning coat, and behind him, on the wall where it had hung for 7 years unlooked at, was an absence. The portrait was gone. The pale rectangle on the wall where it had hung was the specific shape of something that had been carried out of the room that morning. Turned face to wall, placed in the small storeroom at the end of the corridor where things are kept, when they are not discarded but are no longer displayed, where they exist in a quiet that is not erasure, but is the beginning of a different kind of holding. She looked at the space on the wall for a moment. Then she looked at him. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exact quality of his face, which was the face of a man who had set something down and was still adjusting to the changed weight of his hands. He said her name, simply, without the formal title, the first time he had ever used it alone in a room, and in the Regency's careful register, that single syllable was not a small thing. She said, "Eliza." "Yes," he said, with the seriousness of a man confirming something important. "I know." Outside, the first snow continued its hesitant business. The chestnuts along the drive held their copper leaves under the pale white. In the kitchen passage, Nora, who had come to Ashvale in September with Mrs. Fenton's household dismissed and an offer of a better position confirmed, was telling the kitchen maid about the sea voyage she intended to read about next, the one with the harbor at Genoa and the copper water at sunrise, as soon as Miss Hartwell gave her the book back. The fire in the library hearth settled with a small sound, a shifting of coals, the ordinary music of a room deciding to keep itself warm. The snow fell outside the window Eliza had now claimed, and the library held its lamplight, and the pale rectangle on the wall was already beginning to look simply like a wall. If Eliza's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that moved you most. Stories like hers are worth witnessing twice.